Hi, my name is William Wallace, and I'm a lawyer with the law offices of Jason E. Taylor. I practice primarily out of the Charlotte, North Carolina office, but I do practice all over the state. I practice in the area of workers' compensation law, and for the majority of the last 20 years of my practice, I've focused exclusively on workers' compensation. Workers' compensation law is a very specific and unique area of the law and requires a lawyer to be specialized and to have specific training and a lot of experience to be able to handle it. It's not like a typical civil case or a divorce, something you might see on TV even, where you go to court and there's a judge that helps you out or a jury. Workers' compensation law is an administrative process, and it's governed by a specific statute which says what kind of benefits you're entitled to, what kind of process there is. So you really need to know your stuff and focus on workers' compensation to do a good job. Workers' compensation developed at the turn of the century. People were getting hurt at work, they weren't getting compensation, and if they were, it was because they had to sue a big employer. And obviously back in the day, there weren't a lot of lawyers willing to handle cases for a poor employee who gets hurt at work. So the system developed as a compromise. The idea was that industry wouldn't be faced with a bunch of lawsuits every time somebody stubbed their toe or got hurt, but also that employees wouldn't have to jump through a lot of hoops just to get paid for their medical benefits and time out of work. So the North Carolina Workers' Compensation Act was created, and it's governed by the North Carolina Industrial Commission, who sits in Raleigh. And again, it's not like a civil court, and it follows its own rules. Now, when you get hurt at work, what does that mean? What do? You can't file a civil suit, but what's the process? Well, it's pretty complicated and can be pretty detailed, but to break it down basically, a workers' compensation claim is only compensable if it meets two requirements. Sometimes people think, hey, got hurt at work, it's covered. That's not necessarily the case, and sometimes you might need a lawyer to help you figure out if what happened to you is compensable. Okay, well, what kind of injuries are compensable? Well, first of all, if you have an injury by accident, straightforward enough, slip on a banana peel, step into a hole, that's an accident. If you get injured in an accident at work, it's covered. Occupational diseases. We all hear horrible stories about people that are exposed to asbestos or other type of chemicals. Those may be covered. Certain conditions are covered no matter what, certain chemicals. And then there's certain other kinds of injuries like carpal tunnel or repetitive use injuries that may also be compensable. But the law there can be tricky, and again, you may need a lawyer to help you sort out whether or not you've got the type of case that's compensable. Okay, you fall within one of those two categories. What next? Well, you have to file a claim with the North Carolina Industrial Commission. Everything in workers' comp is driven by forms. It's not like filing a lawsuit or you can just call up the Industrial Commission and say, hey, got a claim. You've got to file a certain form called a Form 18. And that tells the Industrial Commission, I was hurt, happened at work. You also have to tell your employer too. It's always the best idea when you get hurt at work in an accident or you feel like you've developed something that's an occupational disease, tell your employer right away. Because one of the biggest things in workers' comp is notice to your employer. And to be fair, even though I'm plaintiff's attorney, an employer should know. If I said I stepped in a hole and broke my leg, but don't say anything for 3 weeks, that's not very fair. My employer needs to investigate. Always try to get something in writing too, because if your employer just says, hey, we'll take care of you, that can be a recipe for trouble. Your employer might be your best pal, but if down the road you need more treatment or you're going to be out of work, suddenly that friendly employer might become a bit combative. Frankly, part of that's because people tend to be skeptical about work injuries. We all are conditioned watching TV about the malingerer and person videoed playing tennis when they say they're hurt. But it's also because workers' comp is expensive. Insurance companies make a lot of money off workers' compensation premiums, but they don't pass those savings on to their employers. Sadly, nothing seemed to be done about that, so employers are very, very leery if there's a workers' comp case. So, fine. I painted this picture of what happens with a workers' comp case. What do? Will you file a form, you tell your employer what happens next? Well, workers' comp, like I said, is not a civil case. So you can't go to court, get a jury decision. you can't get certain damages either. Back when they created that compromise law I talked about earlier, they said, okay, we're only going to have these two requirements to have a compensable injury. So you don't have to prove you didn't do something silly. You could be stupid and step in that hole when you should have seen it. You're still going to be covered by workers' comp. Well, what did the employers get back? They don't have to pay certain damages. They're not exposed to pain and suffering. Like if you were in an accident, somebody ran a red light, they might have to pay for the time you couldn't go to church, couldn't play with your buddies playing golf, or couldn't go to movies because you weren't able to sit in the seat for a long time. Workers' comp has what we call specific remedies, and there's really two of them. One is disability compensation, and the second one is medical compensation. As I say to people often, if it sounds like they're treating you like you're a machine, that's pretty much how the system works. It doesn't really focus on the kind of pain and the sadness and all the things that go along with an injury, that's especially severe injuries. So if you're out of work, they pay you a weekly check. Now, that check is not what you would normally get for your salary. They calculate your average weekly wage. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, normally it is. You take the prior year, or if you work less than a year, you take the period you worked, you divide it by the number of weeks, there you go. And then they take 66 2/3 of that to determine what you should get weekly. So for example, if I made $100 a week, I would be entitled to approximately $67 a week, as long as a doctor said I couldn't work or my employer couldn't bring me back because my restrictions are too significant. Say for example, I work on a loading dock and a doctor says I can't lift more than 5 pounds. Employer might say, we really don't have anything for you, so those checks would be paid. Now let's say I go back, but I can't make as much. I work part-time. Well, they're also responsible for what's called partial disability benefits. And that just means you take the difference in what you earned before and what you earned after, as long as it's due to the injury or any restrictions, and they pay 66 2/3 of that. Same thing, because I'm not good at math, let's say $100 is the difference, they pay you $67 a week. Now employers can offer you light duty work, and as long as it's not something that's, just to harass you or make you miserable, you got to try to do it. But again, sometimes you might need a lawyer to deal with that, because when you get done treating, you always want to be careful that if you have permanent restrictions, you don't go back to work at a job that's not really suitable. And that's the phrase we use, that you can't do. Or that your employer says, hey, we've got a job for you, but we're going to change the description after you settle your workers' comp case. Because then you might find yourself out of a job and having lost benefits you'd be entitled to under workers' comp. The second piece of the damages is pretty straightforward as well, medical treatment. Sadly though, that becomes a big dispute in workers' comp because employers like to try to avoid paying for medical treatment. It's expensive, we all know that. And so you have to be very clear with your doctors as to what's going on with you. Always tell your doctor everything that's going on so that workers' comp knows it's related. Your doctor's your best friend, and if your doctor can't give causation, workers' comp won't pay, and they're probably not going to be made to pay. Or you've got a complicated situation which requires a doctor's opinion or complicated medical testimony, you probably want to talk to a lawyer. There's also something called a rating that you get paid at the end of your treatment if a doctor says you're entitled to one. That's all they have to pay though. There's no other damages. And so really you want to make sure that when you have a claim, you get everything that you're entitled to, because you already know it's going to be limited. But more importantly, you want to protect yourself. So if down the road you have restrictions or you need further treatment, you're not out in the cold because you let an insurance adjuster or an employer tell you this is what it's got to be. So hopefully that was helpful. I can tell you though that if you do have a situation where you need assistance, don't hesitate to call us. We're happy to talk. It won't cost you anything. So if you'd like to talk to us, you can find us online at www.thelitigator.com. We're also on all the social media platforms you're familiar with. Or if you prefer, you can call us toll-free at 1-800-351-3008, and someone will be happy to talk to you about your situation. I appreciate your taking the time to listen to this video, and again, my name is William Wallace, and if you have any questions or would like to talk to a workers' compensation lawyer, give us a call and ask for me.